A lie is most effective when it is wrapped in the cheap fabric of concern, and my son David had tailored this particular lie perfectly. The story begins in the sterile, airless atmosphere of Probate Courtroom 4B, a place that smells of industrial floor wax, old paper, and the specific, acrid sweat of people fighting over things they didn't earn. It is a smell I recognize from job sites where contractors tried to cut corners, the smell of desperation masked by cologne. I am sitting at the respondent's table, my hands folded over the heavy wooden cane I don't actually need but was forced to bring to complete the image of frailty. I am 78 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years making sure skyscrapers in this city didn't collapse in the wind. I understand stress points. I understand load-bearing walls. I know exactly how much pressure it takes to make a foundation crumble. But today, I am watching my own foundation being detonated by the boy I taught to ride a bike. David is on the witness stand. He is wearing the navy blue suit I bought him for his graduation 10 years ago, the one he wore to his first job interview when he was terrified he wouldn't get the position. He looks impeccable, the picture of a concerned, burdened son who has the weight of the world on his shoulders. He is weeping. It is a masterful performance, one that deserves an award for cruelty. He pulls a white handkerchief from his pocket and dabs at his eyes, his shoulders shaking with a grief that feels as manufactured as the polyester in his tie. He tells Judge Reynolds about the incident last month, the kitchen fire that nearly burned down my brownstone. He describes the scene with a trembling voice, painting a picture of a confused, senile old man wandering in the smoke, holding a box of matches and staring at the flames like a child entranced by a magic trick. "It broke my heart, Your Honor," he sobs, his voice cracking perfectly on the word heart. "Dad just isn't there anymore. He's a danger to himself. He needs the safety of the facility. I'm just trying to protect what's left of his dignity." I sit there, silent. My lawyer, a court-appointed public defender named Mr. Henderson, who has barely looked at my file, is doodling geometric shapes on a legal pad. He has already written me off. To him, I am just another senile file number to be processed before lunch, another old man whose mind has turned to Swiss cheese. He assumes the son is telling the truth because sons are supposed to protect their fathers. He assumes I am the problem. Internally, I am screaming. I am screaming so loud I am surprised the glass of water on the table doesn't shatter. I remember the fire. I remember it with a clarity that cuts through the fog they tried to drown me in. I remember waking up to the piercing shriek of the smoke alarm, the air thick and gray, burning my lungs. But I also remember something else, the smell. It wasn't just burning toast or a grease fire. It was the smell of accelerant, lighter fluid, the cheap stuff you use for backyard barbecues. I don't own lighter fluid. I have an electric stove. I haven't grilled a steak in 5 years. I remember stumbling out the back door into the cold night air, coughing, my eyes watering, and finding the deadbolt unlocked. I never leave my doors unlocked. It is a habit from living in the city for 50 years. I lock the door before I turn off the lights. But that night, it was open. And I remember the confusion David speaks of, a heavy, drugged haze that had enveloped me for weeks prior, a fog that made my own house feel like a maze I couldn't navigate. It wasn't age, it wasn't dementia, it was chemistry. It started 6 months ago, the gaslighting. It was subtle at first, like a hairline fracture in concrete. You don't see it until the weight comes down. Keys missing from the hook by the door where I have placed them every day since 1985. My wallet found in the refrigerator next to the milk. Important letters from the bank vanishing from the mailbox. I questioned myself. I wondered if I was slipping. Then it escalated. David and his wife, Sarah, moved in to help after I had a mild flu. They said they just wanted to make sure I was okay. They said they wanted to spend time with me. That's when the fog rolled in. They took over the kitchen. They controlled my meals. They managed my medication, organizing the little plastic pill box with smiling faces. I spent days in my favorite armchair, unable to form complex thoughts, my tongue feeling too large for my mouth, drooling on myself while they discussed renovations in the next room. They talked about knocking down walls. They talked about selling my antique collection. They treated me like a piece of furniture they were waiting to reupholster. I looked at my son's trembling shoulders as he lied to the court, and I felt a part of my soul wither and die. I have to ask you, have you ever realized that the person you taught to walk is now waiting for you to fall so they can pick your pockets? If you've ever felt the cold, sharp knife of betrayal from your own blood, hit that subscribe button. Because I didn't burn my kitchen, and I certainly didn't lose my mind. I lost my son, but I kept my sanity. The turning point came 3 nights ago. It was a ritual. Chamomile with honey, she said. But it always tasted slightly bitter, a metallic tang that lingered on the back of my tongue. She smiled as she handed it to me, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Drink up, Arthur," she said. I took the cup. My hands were shaking, a side effect of whatever they were feeding me. I pretended to sip it. I let the steam hit my face. But when she turned to leave the room, her phone buzzing with a text, I didn't drink. I waited until her footsteps receded down the hall, until I heard the murmur of the television in the den. Then I poured the entire cup into the potted fern by the window. I sat there, waiting. Usually, within 20 minutes, my eyelids would grow heavy, my limbs would turn to lead, and I would drift into a confused, dreamless stupor. But tonight, 20 minutes passed, and my eyes stayed open. 30 minutes passed, and the fog began to lift. It was like a curtain being pulled back from a dirty window. The edges of the world became crisp again. My thoughts, previously scattered like leaves in the wind, began to organize themselves into structural columns. My mind sharpened. The engineer returned. I heard them in the hallway. I heard them laughing. Not the laughter of relief that comes from caring for a sick parent, but the laughter of thieves counting their loot. It was a conspiratorial, ugly sound. I heard David say, "One more incident. That's all we need for the emergency guardianship. Then we sell the house and the portfolio is ours." "I can't wait," Sarah had replied, her voice muffled by the wall, but clear enough to stop my heart. "I'm so sick of smelling him. It smells like old man in here." "Yeah," David said, "he'll be a zombie on Thursday." I lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the rage build in my chest like steam in a boiler. They were planning to burn me down to get to the gold. They were chemically lobotomizing me so they could buy a vacation home and a new Tesla. I spent the next 2 days playing the part. It was the hardest thing I have ever done. I shuffled when I walked, dragging my feet on the hardwood. I mumbled nonsense when they spoke to me, calling David by his grandfather's name. I let them think the drugs were still working. I let them wipe my face when I spilled soup on purpose. I let them look at me with disgust. But when they weren't looking, I was working. I waited until they were asleep. I crept down to the basement, moving silently on feet that remembered every creaky board in the house I had lived in for 40 years. I went to my old tool chest, the big red one in the corner, covered in dust. I dug through the drawers until I found it, the digital dictaphone I used for site inspections in the 90s. I replaced the batteries with fresh ones I pilfered from the remote control. I tested it. It still worked. I taped it under the dining room table, right where they sat to drink their wine and plan my demise. I pressed record, and then I went back to being a vegetable. Back in the courtroom, David finishes his testimony. He looks up at the judge with pleading, wet eyes. "Please, Your Honor," he begs, his voice trembling with false sincerity. "Grant the conservatorship. Let me take care of my father. It's the only way to keep him safe. He doesn't know what he's doing anymore." Judge Reynolds looks at me. His expression is one of pity, tinged with the impatience of a man who has heard this story 1,000 times. He sees an old man in a rumpled suit, leaning on a cane, silent and defeated. "Mr. Vance," the judge asks, his voice gentle, condescending, the voice one uses for a child who has scraped his knee or a dog that has gotten into the trash. "Do you understand what your son is asking for?" I look at David. He is walking back to his seat next to Sarah. He catches my eye. He smirks at his wife in the gallery. It's a tiny, imperceptible curl of the lip, visible only to me. A victory lap before the race is officially over. He thinks he has won. He thinks the scopolamine and the lies have done their job. He thinks the old man is broken, ready to be swept into the dustbin of history. I take a deep breath. I feel the oxygen fill my lungs, clearing the last wisps of the fog. I stand up. I don't use the cane. I let it fall from my hand. It clatters to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Clack, clack, clack. The sound startles the bailiff. It startles my lawyer, who drops his pen. I stand to my full height, straightening my spine, feeling the vertebrae lock into place like steel beams. I am 6'2". I haven't stood this straight in 6 months because the drugs made me slump. But today, I am a skyscraper. The trembling in my hand stops. I button my jacket with steady fingers. I look at the judge. I look at David, whose smirk has frozen into a rictus of confusion. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," I say. My voice is not the raspy, confused whisper of a drugged invalid. It is clear, deep, and resonant, the voice that used to command construction crews over the roar of jackhammers and diesel engines. It fills the room, bouncing off the mahogany paneling. "My son claims I am unfit," I continue, walking out from behind the respondent's table. I move with purpose. "He claims I am confused. He claims I am a danger to myself." I turn to face David. He is pale now. He looks like he has seen a ghost, and perhaps he has. He is seeing the ghost of the father he thought he had buried. I reach into my pocket. David's face goes white. He expects me to pull out a tissue to wipe my eyes. He expects me to pull out a confused, scribbled note. He half rises from his chair, his instinct screaming that something is wrong. Instead, I pull out the silver dictaphone. It gleams under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. I walk toward the bench, ignoring the sputtering protest of my public defender. The truth is a frequency that the human ear isn't always tuned to hear, especially when it contradicts the comfortable lies we tell ourselves to survive the night. The courtroom froze. It wasn't just a pause in the proceedings. It was a cessation of atmospheric pressure, a sudden vacuum where the air used to be. The sterile, fluorescent hum of the lights seemed to amplify the sound of my own heartbeat thudding against my ribs. Judge Reynolds looked at the silver device in my hand, his eyebrows knitting together in a confusion that was rapidly turning into intrigue. He looked at me, really looked at me, not as a docket number or a senile old man wasting the court's time, but as a man holding a grenade with the pin pulled. "What is that?" the judge asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife through heavy curtains. "This," I said, stepping away from the respondent's table and ignoring the frantic whispered protest of my public defender, "is the truth." I walked toward the bench. My legs felt heavy, not with age, but with the crushing gravity of what I was about to do. I was about to execute my own son in the public square. I placed the silver dictaphone on the polished wood of the evidence table. It looked small, insignificant, a piece of obsolete technology in a modern world. But inside that casing lived the ghosts of my family. I pressed play. There was a moment of static, a hiss of white noise that sounded like rain. Then the audio cut in. It was slightly grainy, distorted by the position of the microphone under the table, but the voices were unmistakable. They cut through the courtroom air, amplified by the acoustics of justice, bouncing off the mahogany walls. It was Sarah's voice, sharp, anxious, pitched high with the adrenaline of a crime. It wasn't the sweet, syrupy voice she used when she brought me my tea. It was the voice of a co-conspirator. The courtroom gasped. It was a collective intake of breath from the gallery, the bailiff, and the stenographer. Then David's voice answered. The same voice that had just sobbed on the witness stand about his heartbreak. The same voice that had sworn to protect my dignity. But on the tape, it wasn't shaking with grief. It was arrogant. It was cold. It was the voice of a man discussing the disposal of a piece of trash. Relax, babe. The old man was so drugged up on the scopolamine, he wouldn't know if I used a flamethrower or a match. I wiped the handle. The fire department ruled it accidental. It's done. I watched the judge. His face went slack. The pen he was holding hovered over his legal pad, frozen. The tape continued to spin, the little wheels turning, unwinding the narrative of my son's love. Sarah asked on the recording, "I swapped his heart meds for the sedatives again this morning. He'll be a zombie in court on Thursday. He won't even be able to string a sentence together. Reynolds will sign the paper because he's overworked and doesn't care. We dump him at Shady Acres by Friday afternoon, and the house goes on the market Monday." "I can't wait," Sarah laughed on the tape, a cruel, ugly sound that chilled the marrow of my bones. "Soon," David promised her. The recording ended with a click. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, a physical weight pressing down on every shoulder in the room. The court reporter had stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys, her mouth slightly open. The bailiff, a large man who looked like he had seen everything, had moved his hand to his belt, his eyes locked on David. I turned slowly to look at my son. David had collapsed into his chair. His posture, so upright and righteous moments ago, had disintegrated. He was slumped over, his face the color of wet ash, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was shaking his head, a microscopic movement, mouthing the words, "No, no, no," over and over again, as if denial could rewind the tape. Sarah, sitting in the front row of the gallery, was gripping her purse so hard her knuckles were white. She looked toward the exit, her eyes darting like a trapped animal, measuring the distance to the door. But the bailiff had already moved to block the aisle. "That is my son," I said to the judge. My voice was steady, but it felt thick, clogged with a grief that felt like broken glass in my throat. I pointed a trembling finger at the man in the navy blue suit. "He didn't just lie to this court, Your Honor. He didn't just try to steal my home. He poisoned me. He chemically lobotomized me in my own kitchen." I paused, fighting back the tears that threatened to undermine my strength. I would not cry for him, not here. "He stood here and wept for you," I continued, my voice rising, filling the cavernous room. "He used his tears as a weapon to strip me of my rights. But those tears were not for me." David jumped up. The movement was sudden, violent, the last desperate act of a man watching his life implode. "David," he screamed, pointing at the recorder, "it's AI! He's crazy! He made it up!" His voice was shrill, hysterical. The mask of the dutiful, grieving son was completely shattered, lying in pieces on the floor. Beneath it was the desperate, greedy child I had raised, the boy who used to cheat at board games and lie about his homework. David yelled, turning to the gallery, looking for an ally, finding none. "You can't believe him. That's not my voice." "Sit down, Mr. Reynolds," Judge Reynolds roars, slamming his gavel down with a force that cracked the wood. David lunged toward the evidence table, his hand reaching for the recorder, desperate to destroy the black box that held his soul. "Sit down," the judge commanded. The next 10 minutes were a blur of motion, a chaotic symphony of justice finally grinding into gear. The bailiff tackled David before he could reach me, pinning him against the table. Sarah screamed, a high, piercing sound, and tried to bolt for the door, barring her exit. Judge Reynolds stood up, his face flushed with a righteous anger that matched my own. "This court orders an immediate recess. Clerk, summon the district attorney. I want them here 10 minutes ago." David shrieked, struggling against the cuffs. "I just did," Reynolds snapped. "I am issuing an emergency protective order for Arthur Vance effective immediately. I am vacating the petition for guardianship with prejudice." I stood alone in the center of the chaos. It felt like the eye of a hurricane. I watched the bailiff tighten the handcuffs on my son's wrists. I watched the metal bite into his skin. I remembered holding those wrists when they were tiny, teaching him how to throw a baseball. I remembered the way he used to look at me with adoration. David looked at me now as they dragged him away. His eyes were wet, but this time the tears were real. They were tears of terror. He begged, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, we were just in debt. The gambling, it got out of hand. Dad, help me." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had poured lighter fluid in my kitchen while I slept. I looked at the man who had laughed about my smell. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer forgiveness. I couldn't. To forgive him now would be to betray the man I was, and the wife who would have been horrified by what her son had become. I looked at him with the cold, hard eyes of a man who has just survived an assassination attempt. "I am not your father right now, David," I said quietly. He couldn't hear me over his own screaming, but I needed to say it for myself. They dragged him out the side door, his pleas fading into the hallway. Sarah was let out shortly after, sobbing about how it was all David's idea, turning on him before the door even closed. The courtroom emptied. The silence returned, but it was different now. It wasn't heavy. It was clean. I picked up my cane from the floor. I looked at it. I didn't need it. My legs felt strong. My mind felt sharp. The fog was gone, burned away by the fire of the truth. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was long and lined with marble, echoing with the footsteps of lawyers and criminals. I walked past them all, my head held high. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out onto the courthouse steps. The sun was shining. It was bright, harsh, and blinding. It warmed my face. I took a deep breath, tasting the city air, exhaust, hot dog carts, and freedom. I was alone. I had my house. I had my mind. I had my dignity. But I had lost my family. The branch of the tree that was supposed to carry my legacy had rotted and fallen off. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, ran up to me on the steps. He looked disheveled, his tie askew, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and newfound respect. He wasn't doodling anymore. "Mr. Vance," he panted, catching his breath, I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of practice. That recording?" "I know," I said, putting on my sunglasses to hide the tears that were finally, traitorously, starting to fall. They weren't tears of sadness for David. They were tears of mourning for the illusion I had lived in. "We need to file civil suits," Henderson said, his mind racing now, seeing the billable hours and the justice of the case. "We need to secure the assets. We need to freeze David's accounts before he can access any joint funds." "Do it," I said, my voice firm. "Evict Sarah. Today. I want her out of my house before the sun goes down. Change the locks." "Consider it done," Henderson said, pulling out his phone. I looked out at the busy street, at the people rushing home to their families, to their dinners, to their lives. I thought about my empty brownstone. I thought about the silence that would greet me when I opened the door. "Yes," I said. "Find me a dog, a rescue," Henderson asked, confused. "I think I'm done with people for a while," I said. I walked down the steps, tapping the cane I don't need against the concrete, the rhythm setting the pace for the rest of my life. Click, click, click. It was the sound of survival. I hailed a cab, raising my hand with a steadiness that defied my age. I climbed into the back seat and gave the driver my address. As we pulled away into the traffic, leaving the courthouse and my son behind, I realized that while they had stolen my trust and they had stolen my peace, they couldn't steal my fire. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The old man looking back at me wasn't a victim. He was a survivor of the cruelest war imaginable, the one fought in the living room. I am awake, and I am free.